Welcome to Citizen Athletics. I am Dr. Sam Spinelli, and today we're going to be going through some lean bulk training. I'm going to be training later this afternoon, so I got to get ready, get my coffee going, get some work done. I'm going to go pick up Broden.
These pythons, baby!
In a few hours, and then we're going to go and crush a big workout. So I'll take you guys through it, explain the rationale, and then some of the details that you want to know when you're planning your training to help support lean bulking. There's some specific things that you want to try to maximize to the best outcomes possible to minimize your fat gain while maximizing your muscle gain. So let's get ready. All right, folks, I've eaten, I'm filled up on coffee. Let's go get Broden, crush some weights.
Yo, what up?
Broden is in the house.
Yeah, I'm here. Looking dangerous as ever. Oh, sorry.
That's the exact description I would give. Dangerous.
Dangerous for sure.
Did you get a haircut?
No.
Huh? Looks better.
Does it look good?
All right. Let's go to the gym. Now, when we're looking to train for lean bulking, we want to look at developing the best program possible that's going to maximize building muscle while minimizing fat gain. So there's going to be a few key things that we want to look at to do so. Number one is using a bit of a variety of rep ranges to maximize the stimulus for strength and hypertrophy. So doing some reps where you're going to be going lower, for instance, in some of your compound movements, maybe going with somewhere between 3 and 6 reps and really trying to push for more strength adaptations. Then doing some more mid-range work, so somewhere between that 5 and 10 rep range, and that way you're accumulating a little bit more volume, get a little bit more stimulus for mechanical tension through not just higher intensities, and then also doing some higher volume work, so that 10 plus rep range to really stimulate the last little bit of growth that we could get through some metabolic factors. Generally, we see that mechanical tension is going to be the primary driver, and we'll put a link in the description box down below about the science of muscle growth. But in general, mixing up your rep ranges throughout the week is going to be valuable to at least stimulate a wide variety of muscle fibers and the type of stimulus that we can get. A second factor to consider is going to be the relative intensity that you go to. So even with these different rep ranges, it's going to be about the relative effort that you put in, sometimes called RPE or reps in reserve RAR. That's going to be a reflection of how hard each individual set is. So you might do a set of 5 reps, but your reps in reserve is 1 or 2, meaning you could have done 6 or 7 reps. We see that generally pushing to an RAR of about 5 is a necessity to really stimulate muscle growth. So if you're really far away from failure, you're probably not getting very much benefit for hypertrophy, whereas when you go really close to failure, so somewhere between 0 and 5 reps, you're probably going to get a lot more stimulus to actually grow.
These pythons, baby!
Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to fail or that every set needs to be a full burnout. But what it does mean is that if your training is really easy, you're probably not going to grow from it. So most of the time, we want to be somewhere in the ballpark of an RAR 3 to 5, or what some would call an RPE 6 to 7. Because what's it going to allow for is to still train relatively hard, but not be so close to failure that you're going to get really fatigued from each set. If you go to an RAR 0 or an RPE 10 and max out, well, you're going to have a really hard time repeating that effort and getting in a sufficient amount of volume. And that's where keeping your reps in reserve or your RR a more reasonable amount for the majority of your sets is going to be a good idea. Taking the occasional set, for instance, I like to prescribe people to take their last set of a movement to failure to really stimulate, number one, a good idea on where they actually are in their RR, and also to help them push to failure so that we know that we're getting the maximum amount of growth potential achieved. And doing on the last set limits us from really being too fatigued then to repeat that effort. On the topic of volume, achieving a sufficient amount of volume is important to maximize muscle growth. The exact amount is really hard to say because it does get more complicated when we start to factor in that reps in reserve variable. We see that for a lot of individuals, getting at least 8 sets per week on a lot of different movements that stimulate different muscles. So for instance, 8 sets of pressing movements is going to be a minimum that we want to do to stimulate a relatively high proportion of growth. If you're only doing 4 sets of a pressing movement in your entire week, you're probably going to be leaving a lot on the table. Whereas as we start to get between 8 and 16 or even 20 reps, it's hard to discern exactly how much is going to be the best. And that's going to come down to a lot of individual factors and experimentation from your own training. Once you get into those really high amounts of sets, then we start to actually see a decrease in the amount of hypertrophy, usually because it just has so much fatigue associated with it. As we're discussing training volume, it's also really important to discuss training frequency. So how many times in a week are you hitting each major muscle group? So you could train 5 days a week and do a body part split where you hit each muscle group only once a week, or you could train 3, 4, or 5 days a week and train those muscles more frequently by diverting your volume across more days. When we look at the research on this, we actually see that having at least a stimulus to each major muscle group 2 times in a week is really valuable for maximizing muscle growth. When we start to look at going past 2 times per week, we don't inherently see more muscle growth from it. However, since this is about lean bulking, we do actually see a benefit from a higher frequency, for instance 3 days over 2 days per week, in reducing how much fat mass is gained. When they compare 3 days per week to 2 days per week, we see the same amount of muscle growth, but with less fat gain. A really valuable factor to consider when deciding how frequently should you hit each muscle group. Now, in order to hit these muscle groups, we have a few different ways that we can do it. You can do it through compound movements and through isolation type movements. When we're looking at compound movements, these are going to be movements that generally utilize more muscle groups and more joints in a single action. So for instance, bench press versus pec fly. And we can see that we can categorize our compound movements into generally 4 types of categories. So that's going to be squats, which we're going to be utilizing primarily our knee and our hips, a hinge, where we're more focusing on a hip dominant motion, presses, and then pulls. When we do a hinge based movement, we're going to be working a lot more glutes and hamstrings and our lower back. In contrast with knee dominant movements, we'll hit a lot more quads and a lot more adductor magnus. And then when we start to look at utilizing presses, we're obviously going to be hitting the pecs, anterior deltoids, and triceps. And then with pulls, we're going to be hitting the lats, the mid-back, and the biceps. Then isolation / accessory type movements are going to be best to utilize where we fit in the gaps. So for instance, your lateral delt and your rear delt don't necessarily get hit to the full degree in those compound movements. So sprinkling some isolation movements for the lateral delt and rear delt is really beneficial. Similarly, for the bicep, it doesn't get maximized to the same degree that the tricep does when we're doing pressing either horizontal or vertically. So hitting up a few sets of bicep curls as a minimum per week can be valuable. We see a similar thing with the hamstrings, where they do get worked in hinges, but they don't necessarily get worked to the maximum degree across the whole muscle. And that's where doing some type of leg curl action is going to be beneficial at least once in a given week for most people. And then also for your calves. While a lot of people might be on team no calves, generally training those calves is going to be viable, which you can check out a recent video we just put out on how to train your calves to the best degree. Obviously, there's going to be a few other muscle groups that you could train as well, like your adductors and your abs, etc. But that really comes down to what kind of training you have and how much time you have available for training. These other ones that we discussed are going to be the ones that you're going to want to focus on and trying to hit. And then the other ones that do get worked in compound movements, but maybe not to the full degree, are ones that you can leave if you have extra time for. So that's a summary of the best ways that we can train for lean bulking. We're going to want a higher frequency. You're going to want to utilize compound movements where possible, and then isolations to fill in the gaps. Train to a relatively high effort. Make sure you hit a sufficient amount of volume. And then use a variety of rep ranges to help support training across strength and then achieving a sufficient amount of volume. Hopefully you found this information about training helpful to give you an idea on what your lean bulk training should look like. In our coming video that we're going to do, we're going to break down nutrition and supplements for lean bulking based off the current research. So if you want to see that video, make sure you subscribe down below so you don't miss it when it comes out. Turn on those notifications so you see it as soon as it pops up. And if you could hit that like button, it helps us out a ton. Appreciate you watching. See you in the next video.